Okay.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Florencia Andreola, and together with Azzurra Muzzonigro, we are curators of the project Sex and the City, one of the 13 winners of the call Urban Factor, promoted by Urban Center of Milan in collaboration with Triennale Milano. Briefly, Sex and the City is a genre reading of urban spaces that pursues the overcoming of conflicting dualisms between male and female, production and reproduction, public and private space. Through a series of meetings and a research project that we are developing in collaboration with the Casa delle Donne di Milano, we are trying to build a framework capable of integrating the gender dimension in the reflection of the city in order to provide a useful tool to formulate policies that can organize spaces aiming at the well-being of everyone, female and male citizens. After the stop imposed by the pandemic condition, we're finally able to restart with our meetings, and we are honored and excited to begin with this new phase today with this event, so perfectly aligned with Sex and the City and the topics that we are dealing with. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I would just briefly introduce our guests today, who are, so our first meeting is the presentation of the book Feminist City by Leslie Kern for Verso Books, who was just published, I think, 2 or 3 days ago. So Leslie is connected with us from Canada, if I'm not wrong. Hi, Leslie. And just a few words to introduce Leslie's work. She's an associate professor of geography and environmental women's and gender study and director of women and gender study at Mount Allison University. She holds a PhD in women's study from York University. So as an academic, she writes about gender, gentrification, and feminism, and teaches urban, social, and feminist geography. Okay, just a short bio. Then I'll just pass to introduce our discussant, who is Carlotta Cossutta, who's a research fellow of political philosophy at the University of Eastern Piemonte. She's part of Politesse Research Center, Politics and Theory of Sexuality of the University of Verona, with which she carries out some of her research interests: feminism, queer theories, and the history of humans' political thought. Among her late publication, let's skip it. That's okay. So we thought this meeting today could start from, let's say, Leslie's presentation of the main topic of her books. So then we could, discuss a little bit and maybe open up into fields of also wider reflections, also with the public that we have here. You don't see, but is here. Okay, so I'll just pass the mic to Leslie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me and letting me be part of your event, even from a distance. It looks absolutely beautiful there, and I really wish that I could join you on this, what looks like a beautiful summer day in Milan. So, yes, I'll just show you on the screen the Feminist City book that just came out in the US, UK, and beyond earlier this week. And I thought I would just talk a little bit about why I wrote the book and then take you through the main sections of the book just to offer kind of a provocation from each section. So I'm not going to summarize the whole book in a boring way, but just to say, what is each section or chapter of this book? What question does it raise for us that we could consider? And then I'm really happy to have a discussion with Carlotta and everyone else present. So as you heard from the introduction, I'm a professor in a geography department, and I have a background in women's studies. So I've long been a feminist, and I was introduced to feminist geography as a way of understanding how gendered power, gender roles, and gender relations are part of the environments around us. They're not two separate things. You know, the city or any space is not just like a stage, right, where we just act out gender relations or act out racial relations or act out class and power, but that those environments also play a role in those relations. And being an academic, I get to talk about this stuff all the time with other people who are also researchers and experts in the field and with my students. But what I didn't see was a sort of a wider conversation in the mainstream, one that was more accessible to other people, just everyday city dwellers, everyday people who experience city life in different ways. So I wanted to write this book as something that would be more open for everybody to kind of introduce some of these ideas about how gender is part of our cities around us, what some of the problems are there, some of the ways that cities are exclusive or can be hostile to women, but also some of the possibilities, both for change in cities and also the things that many of us really like about cities and want to really promote and support. So the book weaves together both research from my own work and from many other feminist urban writers, but it also weaves in some personal experience. So I kind of start from the place of my own experience growing up in and around the city of Toronto, of living in London, England, and having my daughter while I lived in London, and then moving back to Toronto for more school and work for a number of years. And bringing in that personal experience for me was part of showing that when we kind of start from our experiences and the experiences of people who've been excluded from mainstream urban planning and urban design, we can ask some different questions about the city and we can see how the city works in a different way. Now, I also acknowledge that my experience is not universal. I have a lot of privileges as someone with white skin and who's able-bodied and cisgendered. So I'm not speaking for all women, definitely, but some of the experiences that I've had might connect with other people's experiences and allow us to start a conversation about it. So I mentioned feminist geography as a field of study that looks at how gender interacts with the spaces around us. And for me, it's a really powerful tool for thinking about power, right? So how power moves through spaces and how power relations are embedded in the spaces around us. And one of the things that we could just point to on a very symbolic level is if we looked around most of our cities, who are the streets named after? Who are the public spaces and buildings named after? When you see a monument or a statue, who is that monument or statue of? And just on that symbolic level, we would get a pretty clear idea of who is considered powerful and important and revered in our culture. And for the most part, it's not women. Women tend to be fairly marginalized in those kinds of representations. But if we dig deeper than that, we can see ways in which gendered power operates in cities in ways that are not just at that symbolic level. So here I'll just start to take you through some of the sections of the book and some of the questions that I raise in them. So in the introduction, I give a little bit of a historical, not too long historical, maybe like a couple hundred years, brief history of the ways in which women have often been seen as problems for cities or problems that cities need to manage in some way. So for higher status women, upper class women, they were seen as being threatened by city life, like their virtue and purity and sexual purity could be threatened by city life because there's just too much chaos going on. There's too many different groups of people. They can't be protected and contained in such narrow ways. So their sexuality and their virtue, their need for their virtue to be protected resulted in urban strategies to kind of contain those women and protect them. And on the other hand, women who were not of high status, and particularly poor women, working class women, and the most, reviled character of all, the sex worker, were also seen as problems because they had loose morals, because they could be vectors of disease and immorality and vice. And so there was also an attempt to control those women to make sure that their problems didn't spread around to the rest of the city. And the provocation that I would offer is that how much has changed in the 21st century? Yes, a fair bit has changed, but I think there are still examples we can look to where women are seen as problems to be contained or managed in the city. And certainly sex work remains one of those problems that the authorities want to find ways to control and regulate the bodies of women engaged in sex work, and men and trans people as well, to regulate those experiences, to protect the wider public, and to shift the geography of where those things might happen. We also know that poor and working class women are still seen as problematic, and often a lot of racist stereotypes go along with that about ideas about people being on social assistance, single mothers, these kinds of stereotypes, and teen mothers. We still see women as being problems for the city in some ways. So that's something I think that we could keep in mind as one of those questions that we raise. To what extent are women still seen as a problem to be controlled in the city? So the first main chapter of the book is called City of Moms, and it starts out with my experience being pregnant and having a baby while I lived in the city of London. And this was the first time that I had the experience of feeling like the city was kind of out to get me, that it was putting actual physical barriers up around me that would not allow me to go about my daily life in an easy, smooth, seamless sort of way. Suddenly, public transportation was inaccessible if I had a stroller, or it was very uncomfortable if I was pregnant. Suddenly, just moving down the sidewalk or attempting to navigate in and out of buildings and stores was a huge problem. And people didn't seem to be all that willing to accommodate me and my stroller and my baby. There seemed to be a sense of like, why are you taking up space? Right? It's inconvenient for you to be in these spaces. What are you doing here? Maybe you should be in home or in the suburbs or somewhere more appropriate for mothers and children to be. So through that experience, it was sort of the first awakening that I had to this idea that spaces around us play a role in gender discrimination, because for the first time I felt as though I didn't really belong in the city, that I was being told to leave, to not go about my life in the normal way. So one of the provocations and questions there that I think connects to some of the themes that you're talking about in this conference around the work of social reproduction and care work, and the extent to which those roles are valued in the city, or are they still seen as something that is confined to the private realm that cities don't really need to deal with, or that we just don't really want to talk about? And maybe this will come up in the discussion, but I think right now, in the time of COVID and various restrictions and lockdowns and shutdowns, we're really seeing that in many cases, cities have done a very poor job of supporting care labor, supporting mothers, supporting those people who do the feminized and unpaid and underpaid work of social reproduction in our cities. So a provocation there is to think about, what does a caring city look like? What does a city that thinks that care labor matters looks like? And what are the things that we need to do in our cities to support not just mothers, but all of the people who do the work of just keeping us clean and fed and healthy and alive on a day-to-day basis, especially in times of crisis or in times like a health crisis, when that work is more important than it's ever been. And yet we realize that for so long we have made it invisible, and we've paid it very poorly, and we've disrespected it and not seen it as something as essential, even though now we talk about essential workers. But we'll see if that lasts. So moving on, the next chapter, I talk about friendship in the city. And sometimes people are a little surprised. Why are you talking about friendship? What does that have to do with city life? And on the one hand, I talk about friendship as a way in which women can experience the city, because we are often encouraged to not be alone in the city. So we use our friends, right, as our sort of group for our own safety and protection, but also just for fun and adventure and socializing and relationship building. But one of the main reasons that I talk about friendship is because I want to open up a conversation about how can we expand our ideas about family, households, kinship relationships in the city. Because we know that for the most part, housing and the residential aspects of cities are still really built around the idea of the traditional nuclear family, usually a heterosexual family with children, involving marriage. But we know that for many people, that is not the norm anymore, or it might only be a small part of your life might be taken up with that. But there's so much more to our relationships. Yet our cities rarely support us having households that reflect different types of families. It can be difficult for people to live together as friends as they get older, or to own property together. There's limitations on who can adopt and care for children or be their legal guardians. But even in a practical sense, urban zoning can restrict things like, can you have an extended family that lives together, or is housing designated for, one nuclear family only? So I wanted in this chapter to ask us to think about what it would look like if we tried to crack open the traditional nuclear family and think about cities that could support all sorts of other relationships. And my argument is that I think our cities would be much more robust if we did that, if we didn't depend on the nuclear family as this sole unit of social reproduction, with all of its problems, with all of its violence in the home, and with all of its limitations, especially for women, and especially in terms of unequal care labor that goes on in the home still to this day. So the provocation is to think about what other forms of relationships could we value, and how could we have our cities set up to really reflect that value. So moving on from friendship, I then move to thinking about being alone in the city. And this is a very fraught topic for women. As we move through the city on our own, we can experience all sorts of things that are on the one hand, pleasant and enjoyable, but on the other hand, there can also be a lot of negative experiences. So one thing that everyone often likes about cities is our ability to be kind of anonymous, right? You can walk down a city street and you're just not invisible, but you are one of the crowd. You're one of many. And you can just live your life, right, in a more open way. There's more choice and possibility than what people often find in a small town or a rural village or even the suburbs. The city offers that possibility. But for women and other people as well, enjoying being alone is often quite difficult. So we know that women experience a lot of street harassment, whether it's whistling, catcalling, someone telling you to smile, commenting on your clothing, just talking to you, right, as you're trying to move about your day, trying to go about your business. And sometimes it's okay, but sometimes it's very hostile and can be quite threatening as well. So I wanted to think about, what does it mean to imagine a city where women, or really anybody, could feel that they had the right to be alone, that they could blend in with the crowd, that they were not hyper visible to others. And in thinking about this, I also wanted to acknowledge that this is a different experience across factors like race. So we know that people of color, Black people in public space are more likely to experience this sort of harassment, have people call the police on them because they consider people of color to be a threat, because they just they're not welcome in public spaces in the same way that white people often are in many places. So there's a racial element to it as well. What does it mean for people to be able to just be in the park, to walk down the street, to go into a cafe and not feel like someone is watching you, that somebody could interrupt you, that somebody could harass you, or somebody could call the police on you? And I think part of that, the provocation there, is to gets us at these questions of who we really think has a right to be in public space, and who we think is in charge of public space, and asks us to really evaluate both our own biases, maybe, and prejudices, but also the way that the city is set up to normalize the ability of some people to be in public and to create limitations for other people in public space. The next topic that I tackle in the book is protest and activism, which are topics that are really relevant right now with so many movements going on in cities all over the world around racial justice and Black Lives Matter. And I wanted to talk about protest in the book because for me, it's an important way that women might relate to the city, right? Because we often struggle for basic things, for basic safety, for access to services. And we've had to fight for those things. Nobody has given them to women without a fight, without somebody saying, we need this, we're going to be in the streets, we're going to be asking for it, we're going to be putting pressure on you to give it to us. So I wanted to acknowledge both the history of all of the women and feminists who have fought for these things before us, and the ways that we are still fighting for them now. And of course, as I mentioned, right now we're seeing the Black Lives Matter movements in cities all over the place. And I think what we're seeing is Black Lives Matter is a movement that's not just talking about one group of people, but that is intersectional in that it's acknowledging that racial injustice is tied up with patriarchy, is tied up with transphobia and homophobia, is tied up with ableism, that these things interact together in ways that are very harmful for different groups of people in the city. So I think as feminists, as women interested in making the city better for everyone, we have to really pay attention to and be supportive of movements like Black Lives Matter, because I don't think that any kind of freedom for women in the city can be achieved without racial justice as well, or we'll be leaving a lot of people behind, and we will just have a narrow kind of white, privileged, middle-class feminism that many people have been trying to dismantle or move beyond for a long time. So the final main chapter of the book talks about fear and danger in the city. And I didn't want the whole book to be about women's fear, women's safety, because I think there is a lot more to the urban experience for women than being afraid. So I do talk in the book about those more positive experiences, the pleasure that women find in city life, access to employment and politics and art and culture and diversity and all of those wonderful things. But we know that we can't ignore the topic of safety. We can't ignore the experience of fear, and particularly gendered fear, that women have in urban public spaces. One of the provocations that I want to raise in this chapter is to remind us to think about domestic violence at the same time, because often, in my experience anyways, domestic violence, violence in the home, partner violence is seen as a problem over here, and then public safety, public violence, stranger violence is seen as something over here. And yes, they're not the same thing, but for women, those experiences are interconnected, and patriarchal gender-based violence doesn't really respect those boundaries in this way. And I think that if we want to make meaningful action on women's safety, we have to think about the home, but often we don't want to talk about that, right? We want to focus on the scary stranger hiding in the dark alley, or a mythical serial killer or something, when really the danger is more likely to be in the home from men that we know, that we love, that we live with, that we work with, that we're friends with, rather than that scary stranger. So we have to keep domestic violence in mind as part of the picture, and cities have to really think about that as an urban issue, not as something to leave to other sectors of society. But in terms of public safety, and again, I think this really connects to the conversations that we're having right now with Black Lives Matter around policing. Because when we think about women's fear in urban environments, we want to make women feel safe. We want women to be safe. So how do we go about that, right? How do we make that happen? And we know there are design interventions that we can try, like better lighting and open sight lines and clear pathways and call boxes to call security guards, those sorts of things. But they don't entirely fix the problem. They're just one small sort of slice of the picture. And too often, the direction that cities have gone to address women's safety is to focus on police, surveillance, so things like CCTV cameras or private security patrolling space, controlling spaces through kind of lots of rules and fences and gates, targeting people that society sees as problematic. So homeless people, for example, or sex workers, or just people loitering in the street. Youth are seen as problems as well. So a lot of the things that are being done in the name of women's safety can actually make the city a lot less safe for other people. So I think as feminists, when we think about women's safety, we have to be taking a very kind of a long view and to say, is the safety that we want, is that going to come through more policing, more prisons, more use of the criminal justice system? Or are we trying to imagine a different society altogether? And it can be hard to imagine that. It's going to be hard to think what is outside of that system. But right now, some of those conversations are happening, and we're reckoning with the fact that increased policing and police involvement has rarely improved the situation, whether you're talking about domestic violence or public safety. So the provocation there is, what kind of city and what kind of world do we want to build in terms of people's safety, in terms of ending violence in ways that don't make things better for one group of people at the expense of many other people in the city. So to wrap up then, I try to end the book by reminding us that there is lots of possibility built into our cities, and that we don't need to take a wrecking ball and destroy everything that we have and rebuild something completely new, but that we have to find opportunities within the spaces that we have for organizing things differently. And this is definitely the COVID crisis is a moment where we are seeing cities do some things differently. We're using public space in different ways. We are thinking about how to recognize the work of care workers and essential service workers. We are rethinking public transportation systems. We're rethinking the nature of work itself and the relationship between work and the home. And I think there's a lot of possibility there. There are possibilities for bad things to happen too, but the conversations that many people are having right now are saying, we can do things better, we can do things differently, and hopefully, if we are working with a kind of a gender equity lens and also racial equity and class equity, we can make sure that whatever world and cities we rebuild moving into our future are not ones that reproduce all of the same old problems of the past. Okay, so I will pause there and wait to see what the discussion brings. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for your book and for your presentation now. If you have been here, you will have discovered that the city is made for mosquitoes, mostly. So it's very beautiful, but, and if you see me doing very strange gestures, it's just that I'm trying to keep them, and ineffectively, actually. Thank you very much for your book, really, that I really enjoyed also because, and I don't want to dismiss it in this way, because it feels a bit in the sense that really reading your book, and it's something that I suggest to all the public here, at least for me, shows me how from different backgrounds, in different cities, in very different contexts, I can really recognize the experiences of another woman, very different from me. And this is something that I think it's interesting when we think about spaces and urban spaces that are very, very different. I've never been to Toronto. I don't know how it is, but I think that it should be very different from Milan, for instance. But there are some things that are still going on. And also, in your historical part, I think that it's really relevant that feminist movement and feminist theorists, from the very beginning of the feminist movement, so since the 19th century, has started to work on cities, to ask questions about how the cities are built, planned, construct, who can live in the cities, what kind of bodies are visible, what kind of work is possible to perform in the cities. And but also, even before, I don't think that is by chance that, for instance, Christine de Pizan in the 15th century decided to write a book that it's called The Cities of the Ladies, talking about the possibility of ladies to build a well-ordered city. And if we look, and this is something that I was thinking about reading the book, if we look, for instance, at the fresco of the Good Government in Siena, I don't know, it's very famous, so maybe you imagine it. It's a well-ordered city, and we never see the inside of the houses of the city in the fresco. So the city is just the streets and the people that are allowed to stay in the streets. And this is something interesting that feminists and trans feminists and LGBT movement have questions from the very beginning. And this is something that reminds me, really, what I think for my experience was the most clear part of the book, that there is a privilege of enjoying being alone in the public space. And that is a privilege that, of course, sometimes women that does not have the chance to experience, but also that tells us something, and it's something on which Leslie really insists, on how we build relationships and friendship, and what kind of space do we imagine in our cities friendship can have. And it's interesting because also Leslie talks about the material geography of exclusion. So there is something in the way in which we create the spaces, public and private, that is a material geography of exclusion. It's not just symbolical. It's not just something that we can perceive or fear or experience in a symbolic way, but as she talked about stairs and strollers, this is a very clear way, but not just these things. Also, what kind of images we can see in the streets we walk by. So if I can see just half-naked women selling prosciutti, it's very different than if I can see very beautiful objects of art. And also, so there is something here about what kind of relationships are we imagining? And it's clear that the cities we are living here in are also reproducing every day this division of a public and a private sphere, a public sphere that is to be well governed, and a private sphere that could stay in some sense in the dark. And that's why I find very relevant and interesting what Leslie was saying at the end. So do not think about, for instance, domestic violence and violence in the public spaces as something very different. And then also on this topic, the topic of the fear, which I agree, it's not the only thing that we have to keep in mind when we think about our experience in the city, but it's something what I found interesting in the book, and maybe you can expand a bit on this, because it's also the effects of fears that are not just the more maybe obvious ones that are not obvious at all, but asking for more police, more control, more CCTV, but also two other things. The kind of experience you have of the city walking by with fear also, in some sense, ask for neighborhoods that are shaped and planned in a way that it's very similar to gentrification, for instance. There is in the book a very interesting passage on the fact that in some sense, some way in which gentrification takes place could be called also feminization. And that's something that I think we, or at least me as feminist, is really something that is questioning me, in the sense that if you look at the places that are very, very common when you think about gentrified areas, so like very nice cafe with different chairs, cozy sofa, it's places that feels a bit like home. And it's interesting, what strikes me is that if we read the first feminists in the 18th century talking about the city, they're all claiming the absolute opposite way of thinking about the city. So the private places should feel more like public spaces, so claiming for domestic work to be made by professional people that are coming in your house, that are knowing what they are doing, and so that you as a mother don't have to perform all the things. And we are going in the other way around. And it's interesting, I'm not judging in some sense, but it's interesting that there is something about feminization and gentrification, security, in which the place like a safe place. Can we imagine safe spaces in a different way that are not similar to our homes? Can we imagine a place that is challenging and stranger and also discomfortable in some sense, but at the same time that can feel as safe? And then also just other two things. The first one is that reading the book, for me, was really clear that there is these things that women and Black people and LGBT people and migrants, undocumented migrants, and a lot of other marginalized people are doing in the cities, is that they are building other cities in the city. So in the sense that they are walking in different streets, both because maybe sometimes me as a woman decide to go in one way because it's more, there is more light or whatever. I feel more safe, but also because it's the cities made by our relations. And it's interesting because in a lot of cities, Leslie mentioned Vienna, but also Barcelona made the similar things. Studying the public transport, you can see that women uses the public transport in a different way, with different paths, with different ways of using it, because they are performing different tasks during the day. And it's interesting to see that there are other cities, there are another way in which there is an interesting part of the book on public toilets. That is a very big issue, but also if you think, and maybe it's because I have menstruation now, and it's something that I'm concerned about when I walk in the city. to have the chance to have a bathroom that in which I can change, and it's not so obvious. And it's changed maybe the way in which I decided to go to one place or another, because I know that I have the possibility to find a public toilet that is decent or not. And it's something that is, so it's not just fear that it's more obvious when we think about the experience of the city, but it's also these other practical things that are really, really relevant. And then the last thing is protest and the city. So trans-feminist, feminist movement have really, really taken back the city in different ways. So through slut walks, to prides, to a lot of different way in which you can access the public space in a way in which through your relationship you can experience, and or at least this is my experience another way in which you can be in the public space, really entitled to be there, but not because you are invisible or because you are really just hiding in the crowd, but because you are hiding in a crowd that made you visible. And this is something relevant. And that I will just close on this. Maybe we can then go back. But there is a quote from Furio Iesi in a book called, that is an Italian philosopher, theorist, in a book called Spartacus on revolt. And he said, only in the hour of revolt is the city really felt as your own city. In the hour of revolt, one is no longer alone in the city. And I'm coming back to the first point I've made. So the privilege of being alone, because you are connected with other people. So the point of Iesi is that you feel alone, that you feel the city that is yours because you feel connected with the other people you are revolting with. And if someone have ever been in something similar, at least similar to a revolt, I think that it's resonating. So the idea that you are doing something with other people, but that really you can also be alone. The city can be your own. But sorry. Prova.
Right? No, so I was finishing. So there is something in this idea of revolting that I think it's relevant also in everyday life. Of course, it's stronger and deeper when we are in natural revolt, but it's also something I think we can experience in the way in which you can go out with your friends or doing things with your with other people. Not because I'm saying that all these things are revolt. I'm fully aware that revolts are serious stuff. But because there is something in the way in which we perceive the cities that really can, and this is something also, if Leslie could talk a bit more, because she said at the end of the book that the idea is not, claiming another perfect plan in which to build the city on, that it's perfect and perfectly made and that will work, but the idea also to discover by using the city, by passing by in the city, discover the way in which it could use or misuse, because sometimes also the idea of using, I think, wrong can be useful. And then trying to also challenging every time the plan that we are doing. And that is something that I think the experience of revolting can help us to do. Okay, Leslie, maybe you want to say something about it?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for that really insightful reading of my book. And I had to scribble down a bunch of notes because I was like, oh, yeah, that's such a great point. Maybe I'll just pick up on one thing because I think it's potentially quite radical, which is thinking about what safety actually is. And I really loved what you said about, you could be uncomfortable and that could be a good thing, or it's maybe not even a bad thing. But I think what we have come to define safety as is this complete sense of comfort, of not being challenged, of not encountering something that is different from us, or a person that's different from us, or a food that's different from what we're used to, or a language that's different from the main one that we speak, or a body that looks and moves differently than your own body. And we've have this notion of safety that really aligns quite well with very like middle class or bourgeois values. And cities are, in the context of gentrification, they're only too happy to kind of promote those values, to have this gentrified middle class takeover of space that leads to this very narrow notion of comfort. So I really am going to be thinking more and trying to talk more about like, what does safety really mean? We could think about freedom from violence as very important, but we really maybe need to expand the ways that we talk and think about safety, because right now we've defined it so narrowly that we're willing to give up a lot of rights and freedoms. We're willing to have our privacy compromised. We're willing to have cameras on us all the time. We're willing to have police everywhere, private security, all in the name of this very narrow notion of comfort. So I think that having that conversation, that much more radical conversation about safety in much wider terms is potentially a really productive one. So thank you for raising that, me.
No. No, okay. Thank you so much, first of all. And I also took, I don't know, a whole notebook of notes. So I don't know. Actually, there is so many things that you've touched upon that are super interesting to me. But maybe there are some parts that I would like to focus my attention, because it resonates with other parts, of this, let's say, research and public program that we are now doing. So, for example, you were mentioning, how somehow public space somehow mirrors the values of our society through giving names to streets and to monuments and to squares and public spaces in general. And actually, this is exactly going to be our next meeting. Our next event next week is going to be what gender of public space, in which we are going to have this discussion. We have invited this network of, it's called Feminist Toponymous. I don't know. And it's a group of women that actually have mapped all the public spaces and streets all over Italy to see the balance between male and female. And also, let's say, in this discussion, we also wanted to bring a collective that is called Contraddizioni from Statale to open up a bit this binary vision, because, there is, in my opinion, also hidden the risk of saying, how many women and how many male. And there is also always the binary bias around the corner. So, in order not to close ourselves in this cage, we also have invited this, let's say, queer collective, to sort of expand also the notion of gender in a more nuanced way. So this is something that is resonating that you've said, and that we're also working on. And the other comment that I would like to make is I found your book somehow very much in line with another book that I'm reading now that is by Caroline Criado Perez. I don't know if you know her, and it's called Invisibles, in which basically the main thesis is saying, for centuries, let's say the universal has coincided with the male, and the feminine has coincided with a niche or a different or something specific. So, and this has informed everything. The way in which cities are built, actually also the design of objects are, let's say, taking the male standard as universal. And so this is something that has profound cultural roots, and then I think this book is also very interesting because she brings in a lot of data from all over the world, showing how this is actually true, and in place almost everywhere. But giving instruments or where to touch with, and it's also something that thinking about our program in general terms, I think this kind of approach is interesting because what we are actually trying to build is, a theoretical and practical tool that somehow gives to a potentially enlightened public administrator the tools to act differently. That's what we want to reach. We want to show where to intervene to make things go in a different way somehow. So, and I think what you've, just said and what you say in your book are super, super interesting arguments in this direction. I don't know if you want to add.
Well, first of all, I wanted to ask if someone has questions. You put up your hand and just do it. And also from Facebook, if someone has questions, can write it down. Maybe we can ask Leslie or Carlotta to answer for it. Now, I was thinking about the matter of relationships in the city and how you live cities around the topic of relationships. And not casually, when we were rethinking our public program, we started to think about how domestic space answers to a model of family which is really isolating. I think it's around. If relationships were different, if family could be maybe something differently thought, we could also try to think about sharing care work, sharing everything that matters with having kids, with the growing up kids, but also with sharing care work about old people. And I think one of the real problems we have in this society we built is that when you have a kid, when you have a family, you're lonely. You have to take care of it, and everything answers to this model. Your houses, your relationships. Nobody will take care of your kid, just even because your house doesn't answer to another kind of idea. And I think that in this case, we can think about not only public space, but also domestic space as something we have to think about. Architecture answers a model. I'm sorry. Architecture as urbanism answers a question, a social question, which is the structure we build, where we live in, and everything is built around this model. And I think that we have to work around many topics that are really hard to rethink now, maybe, but I really hope one day to have a very big house with many friends and grow up our kids together. It will be great.
Yes.
Question?
No.
Okay.
Just one thing on this topic of the house, which also I found interesting, very interesting. It's something that really, and just another suggestion of reading that it's quoted in Leslie's book. It's almost a not so new book, but The Grand Domestic Revolution of Dolores Aden, that really shows how this, that it's nothing new, but her book for me was really, really clear. So this model of the house, it's really recent. It's something that it's really, really recent. And also, but at the same time, it becomes, and it's presented in the public debates and so on as natural. And so also our cities are created around this model. So you have to have your own house, and then you can go out in the city and do your other things. But then you have to come back in your own house, and the people that are relevant for you are the people that are sharing your house mostly, even if you are roommates or housemates. But at the same time, we don't have any other kind of idea of saying, no, my relevant others are people that are living in other spaces, and I have to have a city that is created and imagined in the way in which I can see them. For me, like the changing of a public transport was the best thing that was happening at one point, because it allowed me to go to a house of a friend of mine without changing buses and metro, and it was great. And it's something that it's not really addressed in the way in which we imagine how to live in the cities. And so this is something that for me, yeah, it's really relevant.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about how something like public transportation, which is really mostly set up to bring a worker into the city at a particular time and then out of the city at a particular time. When you have other sorts of things that you need to do in the city, it can be quite difficult to find that bus route to another residential neighborhood, but maybe that's where your co-parent lives, right? Or your childminder or whatever, but we haven't really set things up to look at that. And that's one of those just really concrete material things that could change if we wanted it to, if the will was there, that could open up possibilities for other sorts of family relationships to really thrive.
There's a question.
Hi. Hi. I really enjoyed the presentation, so I'm more on a flow than something like I took some note, and so sorry if I'll be confused. But my question is about something about unexpected use of spaces. I mean, I totally agree, of course, that spaces shape the city we live and the use we make of our cities, public spaces, and so on. But we all experience unexpected use of the material spaces. I mean, in the last 7 years, I lived in 5 different cities in 3 different countries. And the part I enjoyed more was the first part of the experience in the different cities in which I discovered new spaces. And probably because I was not used to these spaces, I used these spaces in a different way compared to the people that live there. So I was wondering something about the agency of our bodies in cities that are real not for us, but at the same time, our bodies are able to deconstruct, to reinvent the way in which we use these spaces. So to focus also on the agencies of our body in redefine the spaces that are built not for us. Something, I don't know, but it's really confusing.
No, thank you. Thank you for that question. That makes me think about Carlotta's earlier comment about revolt, but in that sort of small scale everyday way where we use spaces in ways that they have not been intended to be used, and how important that is for opening up possibilities for seeing space in a different way. And I think it's really important now because so many of our cities have, I think, seen such a move towards, privatization of public space, so much more like corporate control of space and kind of private security that's very top down, that's telling us you can use this space in this way at this time for this purpose, and anything other than that, even if it's just, you have you're drinking in public, which we don't like here in North America apparently, or you're sitting for too long, or you have a barbecue going, whatever, we're very rule bound, and we've given over so much of our public space to this sort of private control that it's really limiting. So I think whenever we can find ways to push back against that, it's really important to do. But I also take your point about, different sorts of bodies do that differently all the time. And I think we could definitely look to disabled people's use of space as a way of reminding us that so much space is set up around a very, the universal body, which is an able-bodied body. But disabled people have to find creative ways to use space every day just to move through their daily lives, creative ways to use their bodies, creative ways to be interdependent on other people. And instead of looking at that situation as one that is, oh, it's a problem, or it's sad, or it's, so hard for people. No, actually, people are doing amazing things all the time that might have, for those of us who are able-bodied, could really teach us a lot about using the city in different and creative ways.
She said thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, okay. If there are another question, I had. Okay. Okay. Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm holding my phone because before coming here, I posted something on Instagram saying that I would be here. And so a very dear friend of mine, he's a guy, and he contacted me after I posted the content of your article for The Guardian the other day. And I want to share his comment, not because I want to, point a finger towards him, but because I think it's also very interesting to hear other people's perspectives on these topics. Which obviously, as women, we can all understand. Hopefully, not all women can understand it, but we can make the effort. But for some other people, they're not so instinctively understandable, I think. So so he asked me, like, talking about the fact that cities could be designed to accommodate women's need. He asked me, what about all the other people? Like, if we try to accommodate everybody, like, it's going to be very complicated to redesign a city if we have so many other categories. So what would you suggest is essential? Like, what is the first thing that needs to be changed? That was one of the questions. And the other question is, wait, where is it? Oh, yeah. He said, don't you think it's more important to change the people's behavior rather than changing the cities? For example, we were talking about breastfeeding in public, which for many women is still a problem. He was like addressing the question as, don't you think it would be more important to change the reason why breastfeeding is a problem, meaning, not feeling safe, or being exposed to possible, like, violence or, you know, ways in people look at you and stuff, rather than changing the architecture? Don't you think it's more important to change humans, basically, and human behaviors, rather than changing the environment? And obviously, I have my points of view on this, and I answered him what I thought was important to me, and I think important to the conversation. But I would like to hear your perspective on this as a way to create a conversation with people who don't understand exactly the point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And your friend asks some good questions that I think come from a place of curiosity. So the first question about, well, if we're trying to fix things for everybody, isn't that just, it's so complicated, and how can things be right for everybody? That's a very common kind of response. I think that, you know, any marginalized group who has asked for something say, oh, well, if we do this for you, then what about for this person and this person? And it's a bit of a deflection, you know, from the real issue. But one of the points that I try to make in the book is that many of the things that I talk about, and that not just me, but many other people have talked about as improvements for equity in urban space, are not just going to make things better for one small group of people, but they actually have very wide-ranging effects. So if you think about just, you know, getting a stroller on public transit, okay, maybe that's one niche group, but actually the same things that help that person pushing a stroller help small children, they help the elderly, they help people with disabilities, they help anybody carrying, you know, a trolley of shopping home, they help people, you know, with other mobility, who are using other kinds of mobility devices, right? So it's not a niche intervention, but many of these things could be seen as things that would make the city better for everybody. So something like public toilet access, again, well, literally every human needs access to toilet facilities, right? It's part of our embodied nature. And if you improve those, then you would improve people's access and mobility through the city, again, for so many other groups of people. If we had good, safe public toilets that include all gender options and space for taking care of people like children or elderly people, it would make a huge difference. So it's important to maybe when we're having that conversation, to say, actually, these things could really like help everybody, and they don't take anything away from anybody. You're not saying, oh, this able-bodied cis man can't ride the bus. Like, he'll still be able to ride the bus just fine. And the second point about changing behavior over changing space is also a really good question. And you know, the simple answer is, well, it's both, right? Like, I don't think that just changing space will fully change society, but we can, I think, make the argument that the environments around us can shape our behavior. And when we make changes to that environment, then it can either constrain and limit possibilities, or it can open them up. So if we think about like the suburbs, especially here in North America, as a kind of home and a kind of environment that really kind of pushed women back in the home, right? It shaped society in a particular way. And that built environment played a role in that. But in a more hopeful way, again, going back to the example of disability. So here in North America, when movements for accessibility were taking place through the 60s, 70s, and onwards to today, changing that built environment changed not just the lives of disabled people, but it changed society's whole attitude towards disabled people. Now, it's not perfect. Obviously, there's still lots of ableism, but having disabled people out in public space, able to go to work, to go to school, to be part of the democratic society, allowed them to be fuller participants in society and made the rest of society more accepting. Again, not perfectly, but more accepting. So changing space can impact society as well. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
If I can just add one small thing on this, I agree totally that it's both and so on, but also that even just the question of who is entitled to have access to that space and how is already a question that is changing things. Not in the sense that, of course, it's like magic. You ask this question and then everything is perfect, but that really, I think, can help us to think on not only how the spaces shapes our behavior, but also our material possibilities. So if I cannot actually reach a place in which to work, I cannot reach that work. Or if I cannot, I don't know, go back at home late at night because I don't have public transport and I don't drive or whatever, I cannot go out at night, and so on and so on. So asking us this question, I think it's also just relevant.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and if I can add, so I think also you were mentioning, I don't know if maybe on the article on the Guardian, yeah, I think, yeah. There is this case in Mexico in which, you know, the train line, in order to the tube, let's say, in order to make women feel safer because of sexual harassment in public transportation and so on, what the administration did was to add a wagon that is just for women, let's say. So, and okay, so there is a debate on this kind of gesture, because on the one hand you're saying, okay, it's more safe for women if they have their own you know, wagon. On the other hand, it's a kind of a ghettoization or a sort of a separation,
Yeah.
you know, because it implies, without saying it, that in all other spaces you're not safe or you're not entitled to be safe, you know. So this is a bit controversial to me, and I'm not quite sure of where to stand, you know, because on one hand, I would say yes, it's a good thing to do, because you're you know, you're helping out, you're trying to protect. On the other hand, that's true also that it implies, you know, that there is an implicit separation. Yeah, I don't know what your impression on a case like this would be.
Yeah, I agree. I have the same feelings about it as you, that on the one hand, that in the short term, if that is going to make commuting and going to school safer for people, then they should do that. But it doesn't fundamentally ask, you know, men or harassers to change their behavior. It's like saying, well, you're just so, oh, boys will be boys, men will be men. You know, we kind of excuse it as if they are powerless to control themselves from harassing or touching or groping people on public transit. So our only solution is to move women to a separate car. Now, it would be kind of funny if we just had like one car for men and then all the rest were for women and people with disabilities and queer folks and elderly people. That would be great. But I realize that's not going to happen. But that's where we have that question of, you know, you can't just sort of design around social problems like harassment and patriarchy and gendered violence. That has to be a broader cultural shift that has to happen.
And also on these specific examples, also is rise the question of who has a woman's body, who can access the women's train. So, and also that the gendered violence that does not only really hit women or people that appears like women, and so I think that also this is relevant.
It's a binary.
Yeah, it's a binary, but also it states not only that men will be men and boys will be boys, and so that everyone in the man, but also that every man in the mixed wagon, I don't know what it's called, but it's safe, and this is not even true. Yeah. And so I think that really, I can understand the idea of making safer a space or a journey. Yeah, but you are forgetting a lot of things. that are also quite relevant. And I don't have an answer, but
Yeah.
Okay, maybe if we don't have more questions, we can close it here. Okay, we're good on it. Okay, thank you very much, Leslie. You've been great.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really lovely to be here, there, and talking to everyone today. Thank you for your questions and your comments. I really appreciate it. And good luck with your work.
Well, thank you
Sounds
very
great.
much. And okay, I hope we will have a future together, doing something together. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, Leslie.
Bye.